June 4th, 2025 was the day everything changed and I started transitioning to Linux. It was a long time coming. I wasn't happy with Windows, like the bloat, the crashes, the lack of driver support my motherboard had for Windows 10. And after seeing the abysmal launch of Windows 11 a few years ago, that has damaged my perspective of the operating system entirely. I knew I would never switch to Windows 11, and I was happy with using Windows 10 for as long as I could. Well, it's October, and Microsoft will be ending support for Windows 10. Some of you guys have older computers that don't have a TPM chip in your motherboard or a firmware in your CPU, so you can't even upgrade to 11 if you wanted to. Your options would be to buy a TPM module and plug it into your motherboard, which may not even work with your motherboard, bypass the TPM requirement, or buy a brand new motherboard or CPU for hundreds of dollars. What if I were to tell you that there is a free option that may even increase your FPS at the same time? Now, after buying and using the Steam Deck shortly after its initial launch, I was impressed with the capabilities of gaming on Linux. All my old games worked, and worked well. That's what planted the seed in my mind, that Windows wasn't the only operating system to game on. I'm here to tell you about Linux from the perspective of a PC gamer, and why you should make the switch this October. I want to start by giving a fair warning. Linux, like anything new, has a learning curve. Some distributions, basically flavors of Linux, make the transition from Windows to Linux much easier. Here are a few distributions I recommend, from most similar to Windows to most gaming performance. Most of these distributions have GUI installers that hold your hand throughout installation. These should also come with desktop environments and some basic apps such as a photo viewer or a browser. Personally, I went with Arch Linux. I don't recommend going straight into Arch if you're not familiar with Linux, or don't have like a Linux user friend on tech support at all times. But you might consider Arch in the future if you're an enthusiast, as it can get you very close to your hardware's maximum possible performance. If you're a Linux beginner and you want gaming performance, I would recommend CachyOS, as it has great performance and it's easy to install and to use. Most people want to just have a computer that works well, rather than to have to learn how to build an OS from scratch and have like a month-long project just to have a working PC. Now, back on the topic of learning, a lot of things either work the same as Windows, or it's like intuitive to figure out on your own. I would say one of the most difficult things to get used to, at least for me, was the file system hierarchy standard. So directories, like what Windows users would call folders, are organized differently, and each directory has a general purpose. For example, the etc folder is used for configuration files or configs, and you can do things like tweak the programs you use. So like the standard is not strictly enforced. You can save videos in your etc folder if you wanted to, but it would be a lot easier to find your videos if you saved it in your video directory, right? Most things like pictures and documents, those are easy to figure out where it should go. But for things that are not so obvious, you can always look things up or make a brand new directory freely and just store whatever you want inside. The second thing that I would say is difficult is the terminal. So this is probably the most intimidating thing for non-Linux users, but I assure you that all the Linux people online who are showing off their terminal, they're just doing it to make themselves look smart. Like, in my opinion, the terminal is not that hard to use, and I don't know, it just kind of looks intimidating to people who've never seen it before. But, you know, if you don't want to use it, there are some distributions that have it set up so you may never even have to see a terminal. I use the terminal more than most people do, and I believe that the commands are easy to memorize, like I said, with repetition, like using it often. But most people don't want to use the terminal for more than they have to. Like, I wanted to game, I didn't want to learn how to script. Like, okay, I get it. I'll say there's like 3 important use cases for the terminal though. that you should consider before you go the full-on Linux mint. I'm never going to see a terminal again. The first thing is to update your OS. The second important thing is to install or remove packages. And the third thing is neofetch. No, I'm just kidding. The last thing would be to learn a handful of super useful commands that will make your life so easy and make you wish you had all this back on Windows. So usually operating system updates on Linux are like a single command, and it can be done while your computer is on, and it doesn't even require you to restart your computer. For example, I can update my entire OS and all of the out-of-date programs in the background while taking care of my Zen garden. And I can just close the terminal once it's done and go on with my day. There's no more forced Windows updates, no forced reboots. Now, if you're wondering what packages are, they're basically applications that can do anything as simple and small as connect to a printer to something as large as the entirety of Minecraft. I recommend using the terminal for this because most, if not all of your apps can be updated with the same single command as well. So as an Arch user, Pac-Man can update my entire OS and all my apps. And it makes it super easy to keep my things up to date and keep my things managed. So I don't like installing packages from different managers because if I need to install an update, I would have to go to every single individual package manager just to update all my apps, when I could just have done it with a single package manager. In the end of the day, that's just me, and this is your computer, so if it's easier for you, just use Flatpak, just use snap packages, I don't care. Like, if you still don't want to touch the terminal at all. Just know that apps you install from different sources will need to be updated from their original manager. Now, when it comes to useful terminal commands, you can look up lists, but I'll give you my favorite command right now. Find. Find does what it says on the tin. Use the find command and use specific flags or options to search for files based off of its name, file type, date modified, and you can even search for the contents inside of the file. So, I can find a list of all my Payday2 perk decks that I saved as a document by searching for a file in documents that has the words crew chief, for example. I just want to say and be clear that switching an entire OS is a huge change. I'm saying that it may be difficult at first, and I get that having every little thing about your computer be just ever so slightly different can get mentally fatiguing, and it can get frustrating over time. What's not going to be a source of frustration are your drivers. Good news. Most of your drivers come pre-installed with the Linux kernel itself. My GPU just works, and I have a multi-monitor setup instantly. I can plug in my Xbox controller and it just works. My audio interface just works, and my microphone just works. I don't need 5 different driver managing programs on my computer. It's already taken care of for me by Mr. Linux himself. Like everything else on my computer, the single command updates all my drivers to the latest version without needing a system reboot. The only driver I could imagine you would want to manually install are like gaming specific GPU drivers. You could see an improvement in gaming performance with gaming drivers such as Mesa, obviously. Now, NVIDIA has a bad reputation when it comes to drivers. I use AMD graphics, which is essentially plug and play, and Intel GPUs are also just plug and play. Those with an NVIDIA GPU may need to manually install their driver like how you would any other package. The only GPUs that are currently supported are those newer than the Maxwell architecture cards. So this means that if you have like a GTX 750 or newer, you should have up-to-date NVIDIA drivers. There are older cards that still have legacy versions of their drivers, but I highly doubt anyone would still be gaming with anything older than like a GeForce 8800 GT from 2007. I'll quickly show a table of what packages or drivers you would install for your current NVIDIA GPU. Note that these package names are for my distribution of Arch Linux specifically, but most, if not all, distros should be using the same names for their packages. And if not, it's something super similar that you could look up online. I will say that a few drivers that do exist for Windows does not exist one-to-one on Linux. So like I have a Corsair mouse, and IQ does not exist on Linux. So what I did was I saved my DPI onto my mouse's hardware storage before I updated to Linux, knowing that I may not have access to IQ when I switch. It turns out that open source drivers for Corsair and Logitech and Razer and stuff do exist on GitHub. If you just go searching for a little bit online, you should be able to find it, especially if you look on Reddit. If you only care about RGB, then you should check out OpenRGB. It's great. Like, it supports most RGB mice, keyboards, fans, motherboards, GPUs, and it can even connect with Philips Hue bulbs. So everything is connected from one package. And all your lights can be synced and programmed together. Like, you can control and sync your LED light bulbs and peripherals, regardless of manufacturer, using just one package. I'll quickly add a little note about Bluetooth. So currently no Bluetooth drivers exist for my specific chip that I have on my motherboard. So I can either buy a $10 plug and play Bluetooth USB receiver, or I could just not use Bluetooth. And since everything I have is wired, I choose not to use Bluetooth. But if you use Bluetooth for any peripherals, then connecting to Bluetooth itself should be a straightforward ordeal, like how you would on Windows, if you're using like a beginner OS, such as Mint. If Bluetooth is like a deal breaker for you, then you should go and research ahead of time if your motherboard's chip has support on Linux or not, or you'll be forced to get an adapter. Now that we got setup out of the way, we can talk about what you all care about. Gaming. I'll split titles into 3 different categories. There's native games, Proton or Wine games, and incompatible games. Native games are games that already have Linux support out the box. So that would be your Team Fortress 2, Counter-Strike 2. Those are examples of some games I play that are native to Linux. TF2 feels the same as when I played it on Windows. And I actually get up to 800 FPS in CS2, which is like a 40% increase from what I usually get on Windows when I play FACEIT. During gunfights with like a lot of moving parts on the screen and smokes and stuff, I usually get around 500 FPS. There's nothing much to say here. Like, native games work how you expect. Sometimes you see minor to huge FPS improvements just because of how easy Linux is to run in the background. I've seen Linux machines use not even half a gigabyte of RAM running idle. I do have a funny anecdote about increased performance when I tried playing Left 4 Dead 2 without an FPS cap. So my FPS started to exceed 1,000, and eventually my game just crashed. It could be from having a fully unleashed and uncapped CPU and GPU, but no other game I've played has had that issue. So maybe it's just a bug, and my FPS didn't actually go past 1,000. My game just freaked out or something. I guess if I had to add something else to talk about, I would talk about Vulkan shader caching. So shaders can be loaded and compiled before you play the game and be saved ahead of time. You have the option to skip shader caching, but I recommend being patient and letting it finish the first time, as it can prevent you from getting microstutters in your games. It can take a while the first time you do this for a game, especially with like a weaker CPU, but it's basically a one and done. The only time you'd ever have to do it again is if there's like a huge update for your game that adds new models or textures and effects and stuff like that. Even then, you already have like the rest of the game cached, so you just need to process the shaders for the noob content, and this makes future shader caches faster. You have the option in your Steam settings to allow shader caching to happen in the background when you aren't gaming. Onto games that do not support Linux, but can be played using Proton or Wine. So these games use a compatibility layer. It's basically like taking every DirectX call and translating it into something that Vulkan or OpenGL can use. If you don't know, DirectX, OpenGL, Vulkan, those are what are known as graphics APIs, which is basically how your program tells your GPU what to draw on the screen. Each API uses its own language, so Proton or Wine just takes every call from Windows and translates it into something that Vulkan can understand or Linux can understand. So this is different from an emulator. It's not an emulator or a virtual machine. It's like it takes the game and translates it into a different language that can natively run on Linux. By default, Steam will only show you native games in your library, so you need to go to your Steam settings to allow you to start downloading Proton games. Something to note is not every game is compatible out the box. So this is where something like ProtonDB comes in. So ProtonDB is a useful database for figuring out how to get games to work on Linux. You search for a game, you find its rating. The rating or score of a game tells you how easy or difficult it is to get that title to run, as well as if the title has missing features on Linux. If users have had to make tweaks to the game to get it to run, they usually include what steps they've taken so that you can play the game as well. Custom game launchers exist for non-Steam games with built-in Wine or Proton compatibility. The most common managers include the Heroic Games Launcher, Lutris, and Bottles. I don't play many Windows games that aren't on Steam, but of the ones that I do, I can just launch the exe and it runs using Wine without having to use any of these custom launchers. The only non-Steam launcher that I use is the Minecraft launcher. When it comes to Minecraft specifically, I actually recommend using something like the Prism launcher. One of the big reasons I don't play Minecraft much is because every single update breaks all my mods, and I don't like having to drag and drop all my mods into the folder each time I have to update them. But Prism makes it easy for me to install mods, so I might start using that now. Prism and many other modded launchers are also natively supported on Linux. Staying on the topic of modding games, I have 3 games which I regularly play and I mod. That would be Minecraft, Left 4 Dead 2, and Payday 2. Like I said, Minecraft mods can be installed easily using modded launchers, but I'll show you where my mods folder is on Linux in case you wanted to know where Minecraft mods should go, and this is just if you're using Mojang's vanilla launcher. Games like Left 4 Dead 2 get their mods from the Steam Community Workshop. I just subscribe to a mod and it just works. Payday 2 modding is identical to how it is in Windows once I enabled compatibility mode. Payday 2 is natively supported on Linux, but I actually forced Steam to download the Windows version so that I could play with Windows users. For some reason, Linux users can only play with other Linux users, so doing this lets me play cross-platform with everyone. This comes with a side effect of making the mod installation process identical to how it is on Windows. You just download the custom DLL file, replace the one in your game files, and launch the game. I install mods the same way too. I just unzip the mods and I put them in the mods folder like how I would on Windows. The process is different if you're playing on the native Linux port, so I'll put a guide on how to set that up in the description. But I've been playing modded Payday for years on Windows before switching over to Linux, so I just stuck with what I knew. Modding Beat Saber and installing custom maps and models and stuff like that, it was easy using BS Manager. It's basically the same as on Windows. These are gaming tools that aren't the same as mods, but I don't know how to categorize them, so I'll just start listing them off here. Game mode on Linux is like Windows game mode. It tries to increase performance in games while it's running. Windows does this by allocating more resources to your game, and Linux's game mode works by optimizing your CPU and GPU performance. VK Basalt, or Vulkan Basalt, is basically just Reshade on Linux. I've only ever used Reshade once on Windows, and I haven't used it since, so I naturally didn't choose to install it on Linux to test it out. I can't really tell you what it's like to use Reshade, or VK Basalt even, so I just know that it's supposed to make your game look more visually appealing. Mango HUD is basically Riva Tuner on Linux. It shows your FPS, your GPU and CPU usage, your frame times, PC temps, and all that jazz. It's great for benchmarking games, if you're comparing them to Windows performance or you're just overclocking. Speaking of overclocking, this is where I found most of my performance gains on Linux. From my own personal experience, I can reach a higher overclock and a lower undervolt on Linux versus on Windows while still being stable. My PC is stable with my current overclock on Linux, but crashes my Windows quite often, and reliably, actually. I also use scripts that I've written to basically change my GPU and CPU profiles to use more power when I really want a huge FPS boost. I have them set to low power mode by default, so I use less electricity when I just use my PC for tasks like watching YouTube or writing this script. I can't say much on the topic of Raytracing on Linux because I don't play Raytracing games often. What I can say is it's no different than from Windows. You just go to your settings, you turn it on, and your reflections look pretty cool. I'm not huge on Raytracing, so I don't have much to say on it. It just looks cool, I guess. I've played Portal 2 and Half-Life 2 RTX on Linux. That also looked pretty cool. I have even less to say about frame generation. My computer is pretty powerful and I've never had the need to use it. From my research, FSR is supported, but DLSS frame generation is not. You can use LSFG or lossless scaling frame generation, which I will link below. It's a universal frame generation program that can work on any game and GPU. It comes with built-in upscaling as well, but I will say upscaling is supported on both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs natively on Linux. Emulating is a wonderful experience on Linux. I was even able to set it up on the Steam Deck years ago before I even learned how to use Linux and before I even realized the Steam Deck was running on Linux. Melon DS was my drug of choice. I have hundreds of hours in that thing. Because the Steam Deck is running on Linux, any game or emulator that works on the deck can run on your Linux PC. So many emulators support the Steam Deck now that you should be able to find an emulator of any device on Linux easily. VR was not so wonderful of an experience, I'll be honest. Figuring out how to get it to set up and get it working was a pain, mostly because Steam VR just doesn't work well on Linux. It even bricked one of my base stations during a firmware update, but Steam support replaced it for free. When I got my replacement, I used a third-party VR runtime like Monado, which worked. I launched Monado before I run Steam VR or VR titles, so Steam VR uses OpenXR runtime instead of its own Steam VR runtime. There's a site I use called VR on Linux, which gives a huge list of games, software, and hardware that is supported on Linux. A surprising amount of information about various VR hardware and software has been tested by this dedicated community. I mean, it's surprising because VR gaming is already niche, so VR on Linux is super niche. Yet we have this huge wealth of VR knowledge. So many things have been tested as well, like even things that I weren't expecting to see, such as Vive trackers, the big screen beyond, and like Apple Vision Pro. Those have all been tested. The site also has a ton of troubleshooting guides, which is super helpful. It's not all sunshine and rainbows in Linux land, however. There's a huge elephant in the room. Kernel level anti-cheat. There's no getting around this. Like, you have games that don't run well, even with Proton, or games like Roblox, which purposefully closes if you're on Linux. These games can be run with Winboat, but kernel anti-cheat, your only bet is to dual boot, which is what I do. Almost all of my games run on Linux just fine, but face it, anti-cheat requires that I play on Windows. I have to suck it up and play on Windows 11 if I ever decide to play on Faceit, which I rarely do. At the moment, there is no workaround and it just sucks. Some kernel level anti-cheats like Easy Anti-Cheat or BattleEye have Linux support, but game devs need to opt in to the Linux support for it to work. For example, VRChat has Easy Anti-Cheat for some reason, and the devs just had to enable EAC Proton compatibility. It might be slightly more complicated than this, but from what I've gathered, it seems like there's just like little to no work on the game developer's part except to enable Linux support with EAC or BattleEye. Unfortunately, a lot of game developers choose not to bother with Linux because it's such a small percentage of gamers. If more people choose to use Linux, games will be forced to start supporting it, or they may lose out on some revenue. Though as it stands, this is the only thing that Linux cannot do, and would require a dual boot. Switching to Linux has been a game changer. Seriously. It's not perfect. Like, I still need Windows for Faceit, but for everything else, it's given me a smoother and faster experience. It's been super transparent. I know what programs I'm downloading because of the free and open source nature of Linux and its software, where all the code is visible and readable. Gaming on Linux has come a long way, and it continues to get better on all fronts, from VR and emulation to competitive gaming. Switching to Linux wasn't something I decided to do overnight. I've been thinking about it for years as I've grown more and more dissatisfied with Windows. Switching to Linux isn't something you can just do in a day. It took me weeks to settle on a distro that I'd be happy with, and it took me weeks to decide how I wanted to decorate or rice my Linux. Getting comfortable with Linux took a couple of months as well, but if you're tired of bloat, crashes, forced updates, or if you're having your PC artificially expire due to the end of Windows 10, and you don't want to have to buy a whole new computer, I want to tell you that Linux isn't something that you should be intimidated to try. I think you should give it a shot.